Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up with special guest Sarah Smarsh, and she's here today to share with us her new book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth. Now, Sarah has reported on socioeconomic class, politics, and public policy for The Guardian, The New York Times, The New Yorker, Harper's Online, VQR, Pacific Standard, Long Reads, the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, and many others. She was a Sorenstein Fellow at the Sorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government during the spring of 2018. So let's welcome to the show, Sarah Smarsh.
Thank you so much for having me.
What a pleasure it is to have you here, Sarah. And my goodness, your book, Heartland, it's getting such great reviews. As a writer, you must be so proud.
Well, it's certainly an embarrassment of riches, and in a particularly challenging and competitive industry, it does feel pretty good to have the book connecting with so many people in a deep, real way. So yeah, I couldn't feel more blessed.
Well, I think your book, and the reason why people are connecting with it so much, is because it's almost like telling their story when they read it. They're like, for a lot of people, or maybe it's, coming to an understanding of something they've never known before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that the connections that are being made are twofold in the sort of way you describe. One is a group of people who have not felt validated in some way or seen or heard in their own lives. And they aren't necessarily from the same world that I'm from, but there's something about the struggle described that feels universal. And then there are folks for whom their eyes are being open to a way of life or reality in this country that they hadn't previously understood it at the real human level. So yeah, one of the most wonderful outcomes of the book for me is that it seems that people of all stripes are connecting with it, maybe for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. And doing that. So what led you to, what's like the inspiration to write Heartland? What brought you to that point?
Well, this is a question that's kind of impossible to answer because it wasn't as though it occurred to me to write the book and then I set out to write it. It was more of a lifelong mission that I literally don't even remember a moment when it was not something I sensed that I was going to do. So even when I was a child, I would tell my family, I'm going to write a book about you someday. And I very strategically made decisions along my academic and professional path to make it possible, whether that be, my extracurricular activities or the internships I took or the majors that I chose. And, so I actually got my first research grants to start working on this book when I was a senior in college 16 years ago. One of the reasons that journey took so long, excruciatingly so, was that I had to, for many of those years, I was in poverty and I was just waiting tables and we're also working as an underpaid journalist here and there, trying to get by, and you have to have time and resources to work on something like a book. So that slowed the process down. But yeah, so it wasn't as though I came to a point at which I said, I'm going to write this book. It was more, I always knew I was going to do it, and it has taken me 38 years to get it done for various reasons.
Was it hard to collect like the family stories or things that had happened during those periods of time? Was your family really good at keeping records?
So one thing about poverty that I think might be kind of lost on middle or upper classes of society is the way that it really wreaks havoc on records keeping, and there are multiple reasons for that, but the transient nature of poverty, jumping around from address to address or from school district to school district, means that just the raw chronology of a family's story can be lost to the years and to, just misplaced documents and so it was difficult to piece that together. And while much of the research that I did was while wearing a more journalistic hat about bigger issues in the country, I also was doing, real archival research and also interviews within my own very private family experience, just to try to get the time, dates, and places and events right. I write in the book at length about family experiences at which I was not necessarily even present. So even though the book is called a memoir, it really is more a generational story of a family than it is just my own coming of age. And so, it was a real challenge piecing that together.
At what point in your life did you learn or realize that, hey, my experience growing up is a little bit different than maybe somebody else's?
So when I was a kid growing up on a farm west of Wichita, I really, and I was a child in the 80s and a teenager in the 90s, and even though that was a moment in which some classes of society were shifting toward a cable news era or an internet era, for folks like us, we didn't have cable TV, we didn't have a computer in the house, let alone internet, and so for that reason, I really was quite naive about our family's place in the country's socioeconomic pecking order. And maybe that was a blessing, I don't know, but I think that if I had had more access to the kind of globalized and constant information network that kids all over the place have today, maybe I would have come to this understanding that you're asking about earlier in life. But for me, it was not until I was a first-generation college student on the University of Kansas campus that I saw the extent to which, I, as they say, grew up poor. I honestly didn't exactly understand that. I mean, I knew my family worked constantly and hard to get by, and I knew there were a lot of things that I wanted that I couldn't have. But we had enough food and we had a roof over our heads, and so, to my mind, I never in a million years would have used the word poverty to describe our experience. But when I, as a young adult, started learning how these things work, it turns out by every measure, whether it's federal income guidelines or just cultural experiences, we most definitely were severely economically disadvantaged.
Well, in your book, I mean, it's like I said again, it's just so very well written and gives such a beautiful, honest account that people can really get an inside view into maybe a life that they don't know about, or they can really relate to it. You also talk in your book about, just the physical dangers that, those who are in poverty experience. I'd love for you to just kind of expand on that for our listeners.
Sure. I think we often talk about economics in this country in a very abstract way. One of the things I try to accomplish in the book is to remind us that ultimately any policy or cultural force, all these things that can feel kind of amorphous or cerebral, ultimately they're experienced by us at the level of the individual human life. And many of the policies and economic woes of the American poor translate very physically into their individual bodies, and often in a very negative way, and sometimes even with mortal danger. So, my family members worked and still work jobs that are extremely physically dangerous, from agricultural work to construction, even, stocking retail shelves, or even working in the service industry as a female comes with physical dangers for your gender. That doesn't necessarily have to do with manual labor, but rather just physical vulnerability in an unprotected space. So these are all realities that have to do with one's just essentially having to put your body in a dangerous place because people of more means who don't have to work in such an environment will not, and therefore those dangerous spaces are left for the least privileged among us.
Mm-hmm. Where they're having to take these risks and do these adjustments, and it's just tough and heartbreaking to see at the same time, but there's this level of expectation that people are going to do that work and they have to get in there and do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think there would be a way to make those spaces safer. One thing I try to get across in Heartland is that I'm not averse to hard work. I actually kind of thrive in that way, and it's how I was raised. And I don't have anything to do anything against work. What I have a problem with is the way that we often view the people who hold particular jobs as lesser or disposable even. And so these physically dangerous jobs that we're talking about could be made much safer, often by billion-dollar corporations who underpay their workers and can't spare money for a safer work environment.
Yeah, all those things really need to be taken into greater account, and I think your book really highlights that very well. One of the other things that you talk about, you mention as a function of poverty, often mental illness goes undiagnosed among the poor. And it's, I'd just love for you to kind of share a little bit about that.
Sure. So I was born in 1980, and really this moment, sort of crisis moment that we're in as a country in terms of access to health care, was beginning to come to a head as I was coming of age. So I was delivered by just truly an old-fashioned country doctor. It was in a hospital, but he was a doctor who had a little office on Main Street of a small town in rural Kansas, and made house calls within relatively recent memory out to rural homes, and then as I was growing up, essentially the general healthcare industry became an increasingly urbanized and corporatized entity that was just completely enmeshed with the private insurance industry. So I grew up without insurance, but was still able to here and there access essential care from a small town doctor. I don't think that would be the case today, because that same doctor would be sort of under the thumb of an extremely powerful insurance industry. So that's all to say that a lot within that discussion of healthcare, actually some of the first piece of that to become inaccessible, based on my research at least, was mental health care. So state mental hospitals, from which my maternal great-grandmother benefited when she was having struggles with mental illness in middle age. And this would have been in like the 1960s and 70s. She was able to access those state mental health hospitals. They were all pretty much shuttered and closed by the time I was a kid. And then that trend of sort of stripping away the public access and creating a more expensive and more privatized general healthcare industry happened over the course of my childhood. And now we find ourselves at a moment where, even for the gains of the Affordable Care Act, we ultimately have a society where most people, many people who need care, can't afford it.
Yeah, that's so true. And then when you're in a rural area, it seems like you're even farther away from being able to get the care that you need to get in many respects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for us, our geographic isolation, relative isolation, and just lack of proximity to care was made our struggle in accessing doctors twofold, and that remains true today, and actually even more so. I was talking earlier about the closing of of public mental health facilities, hospitals. Now we're at a moment where the economic decline of places like where I come from is so severe that even private healthcare enterprises are closing in small towns for just lack of population in some cases, and public policy disproportionately burdening them in some economic ways has meant that now a lot of small towns don't even have hospitals, and so people find themselves, 100 miles or more away from the closest professional healthcare facility. So that can be, when you compound that with the kind of physical dangers we were talking about earlier, be they in agricultural work or some other industry, that's a quite dangerous way to live.
Was there anyone within your geographical area that wasn't struggling financially?
Gosh, I mean, growing up as a kid, I suppose I wouldn't have had a complete vantage on that, and so I'm not sure how to most accurately answer it. But I can say that within, class and economic realities are so relative in the way that we talk about them and experience them. So what I mean by that is I was at a small rural high school where, let's say for an elite prep school in the Northeast, someone might look at that school and just lump it all together as one economic experience, like the rural working class or whatever. But for me, within the context of that small town and small school, I was on one of the lower rungs in terms of, I was more poor than most of my classmates and friends. Some of them I experienced as, like, let's say middle class. If your dad was the small town, was a mail carrier and you lived in town and had a nice little house with a nice yard and went to Wichita every weekend to go to a discount clothing store. Like, to me, that represented, like, I wouldn't go so far as to say wealth, but financial comfort. And so, as far as how we describe the middle class or wealth or the upper class or whatever in this country, I think that the way that I saw the world, yes, those levels existed in my midst, but I'm not sure that someone from a more privileged background would say the same thing.
Well, and so with having the experiences that you have, how do you feel that all of that has shaped you today?
Oh, gosh, well, that's an immense question, isn't it? I think...
Really?
I think that's probably impossible for me to answer or know, but one thing that I try to emphasize when I approximate the answer is that there were so many beautiful things about my upbringing and joys and humor that I think usually the stories that get told about poverty or even the working class in this country are told by people who maybe don't have firsthand ownership or experience of those places and worlds and realities. And for that reason, the story often fixates on the trouble therein or the crisis of the situation, and those crises and troubles are probably why my book exists, and it's why narratives, tend to the problems, because we need to articulate problems in order to solve them. But I think it would do a disservice to my family and place and upbringing to cast it as an entirely terrible thing. In fact, one of the most formative aspects of my upbringing, I think, and who I am today, is the resilience and courage and humor in the face of despairing circumstances that we were required to find within ourselves. And I carry that with me today in every experience I have. And so of all the many ways I might not know that my upbringing shaped me, I know that that's true, and it's something I'm really grateful for.
I can imagine it would also make you very kind of creative and, having to look at different ways of solving problems than most people, ever get from any kind of education.
Oh, certainly. Yeah, there's I can't think of any experience that requires more creativity than being financially destitute in this, highly consumerist society. So we live in a world that requires constant transactions with money. And if you don't have money, there's going to be a lot of clever problem solving, whether it's these, elaborate coupon schemes that people now come up with. I think there's even been reality TV shows about the way that people leverage the power of a coupon and look for, we would watch for typos in advertisements that then legally had to be honored if we went to the store and said, well, the Sunday ad said it's 19 cents a pound for potatoes, and it's a typo, but you have to honor it. So, and, just the work, my mom was a very creative woman in terms of language and art, but she also, probably her most handy kind of creativity in our world was that she was very keen at seeing, okay, what in this place or circumstance is going to require someone to make some sort of purchase, or what is it that they want that they can't access, and then she would find a way to sell that thing to them. So yeah, it's a constant. Creativity isn't a word that we often associate with that experience, but that is what it requires. And I don't know a single person who's ever lived in poverty who wasn't really a creative master in that way.
Yeah, without a doubt. That's very, I just love hearing these stories. And it kind of, my next question here is, did you know at a young age that you were going to kind of break the mold in some ways in regards to the cycle of poverty or young, getting pregnant young and move out and do something different?
Well, I knew that I had that mission, certainly, from a young age. I was a very bookish kid, ambitious. I loved school. And, I was precocious enough to look around and say, I love my family, but I see how some of the ways they struggle. Maybe I can figure out some way where ultimately my outcomes won't be so severe. And I was pretty strategic in my life about how to get that done. I knew I'd need to get straight A's to get scholarships in order to go to college. And then once I got to college, I knew I would need to get straight A's there to get, maintain those scholarships and get things like internships that would turn into connections that no one in my family had. So yeah, I certainly had that goal. I wouldn't go so far as to say I knew that I would, because I certainly didn't take that for granted any step of the way. But yeah, it was an awareness at an early age that I hope to break some of those cycles, as you say.
Yeah, and kind of move forward. I know you have said that you get people that come up to you all the time and ask you, how did you escape? How did you get out? Of poverty. And, I'd love for you to share what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, this is something that, so as a writer, I end up as kind of a commentator on class within the news media, just because the thing that I write about is timely to our national discourse. But ultimately, I'm a writer at my core. I love language. I think about word choice. I love poetry. I think that the words that we choose matter, and they tell us something about our beliefs. And sometimes they're toxic. And one of those toxic linguistic framings, to my mind, is how we talk about places and experiences as something that a child might, or any person might, quote unquote, get out of. And so, if we're talking about the experience of poverty, then I can get with that language, certainly, and that was a goal of mine, to get out of the cycles that were so dangerous and negative for the people around me. Now, I think that in this large geographic country, we sometimes conflate that experience with an actual physical place. And so we are by saying, oh, he got out of small town Mississippi, what we're saying in that language often is no one would or should want to be in small town Mississippi. So good on him. And actually, there are all sorts of people like myself in this country who feel deeply connected to their roots, and they don't want to leave their home or their family, but what causes them to do so isn't disdain for the place. It's just economic imperative in a country that has, sold a lot of those sorts of places down the river. And so, it's, I challenge people to question that language about the escape or the getting out. Are you talking about an experience and a negative cycle? Okay. But if you are also sort of condescending to an actual place that has maybe higher rates of those struggles and perhaps by no fault of their own, then I think we should really examine that as a country. I live still in the place I grew up, and that's very intentional, and it's something I'm proud of as a writer who's often encouraged to live in more cosmopolitan places.
Well, I applaud you for doing that, because I think there's something about going back home, and it also kind of lifts the community up that you're in as well, to give them ideas that there are other possibilities, in regards to life. Not that one way is wrong or not, but also bring light on what's happening within the communities and how economically that can be brought up together.
Right. Yes.
So when readers, when they get your book, Heartland, what is something that you want them to take away from your memoir?
I guess for me, the ultimate hope at this specific moment in the United States and the world, really, where we find ourselves in such a contentious political climate where division and conflict reign in our perception of ourselves. Division and conflict is always the stuff of headlines, and that will always has been the front page of newspapers. Nothing new about that, but there is a particular nastiness and rancor about this moment, 2018, politically in the United States. And I hope that my book might be an invitation for people who feel wary and beleaguered in this moment to heal in some ways by connecting with human stories about human lives in a way that, while it certainly intertwines with public forces, ultimately, I think kind of transcends politics. So there are human experiences that go deeper than political labels, and there are truths that are universal regardless of what divide or separate us. And that's my hope for the book, that people might find those connections and feel some relief in it.
Sarah, my goodness, your book, Heartland, I absolutely loved it, and I can't say enough good things about it. And for those who are looking for a special gift to give somebody this year, Heartland is a beautiful read. Where can people connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your book?
Sure. So I have a website, sarahsmarsh.com, easy to remember, where I try to keep my events up to date if people are wondering where they can see me traversing the country on book tour. And then I am quite active and prolific on Twitter. My handle is @Sarah, that's SARAH_Smarsh. And I also have a public page on Facebook that people can search for and easily find. I check in there and have pretty robust conversations with folks. And so I would love to meet your listeners along the way.
Well, I've enjoyed your book and highly suggest everyone pick up their own copy. Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you, Marianne. Thanks so much. This was great.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you and, of course, to talk about your new book, Heartland. Heartland's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all major retailers, and, of course, our indie bookstores. Again, if you'd like to connect with Sarah, you can at her website, sarahsmarsh.com. We'll have the link below. Make sure to check out all the articles she's writing on. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.